Until the pandemic hit, most of what I was focusing on were things like voter, disinformation, Facebook's policies, hate speech online, that type of stuff. But when the election-related effects of the pandemic became apparent, I sort of took off my hat as a cyber expert and moved and put back on my hat that I used to wear when I was the research director of the Presidential Commission on Election Administration in 2013. This was the commission that President Obama put together to deal with long lines on election day, natural disasters in voting, and a whole host of other problems. We weren't thinking about pandemics at that point, but what became clear in March was that the pandemic was going to have severe impacts on this election. So what's the problem? What exactly does the pandemic pose sort of for American democracy this year? And the problem is that we need to move tens of millions, maybe as many as 50, 60 million people toward a different voting system than they are accustomed to. Now, everybody, whether they are moving to vote by mail and have not voted by mail before, or whether they're returning to polling places, everyone's going to be voting in a little bit different way than they have historically. But in the United States, we have never attempted such a massive shift in the basic way that we vote in just a 4-month period. Next slide. Yeah, and you can go to the end of this slide. This is not, as we say in election administration, this is not rocket surgery, right? The solutions here are sort of clear. We need to move as many voters as possible to vote by mail, and we need to retrofit our polling places as much as possible to avoid the risks to voters and poll workers. This is not as easy as most people think on the outside, and it also represents a continuum of options, not just a choice, and all jurisdictions will and should have some mix of the two. Next slide. So what are the constraints that are preventing us from meeting this challenge right now? Now, the most important resource is actually time. If we had 2 months in order to deal with this problem, or if we had 2 years to deal with it, instead of 3 more months, we would be able to meet this. So places like Oregon and Washington, over a course of a generation, had moved to vote by mail, but we don't have the time. And we don't have the money. Congress appropriated $400 million, but that is probably 10% of what is needed in order to pull off this election. If you add together all the other expenses that are new as a result of the pandemic. And so we need to buy people, places, and things. We need more poll workers to staff the polling places. This is a crisis, particularly in communities of color, where we have, where there's going to be significant polling place consolidation. The average age of poll workers in the United States is over age 61. And so they are at most risk for the virus. And so many of them are not showing up to be poll workers. Similarly, we have a shortage of places. We don't have enough suitable facilities in which people can vote with social distancing. And we need the PPE, we need things, we need certain types of equipment that are in short supply, both equipment with respect to mail balloting and with respect to in-person voting. Just quickly, there are sort of structural impediments in the American system which make this kind of shift very difficult. The incredible decentralization that we have of our election administration system, where over 10,000 local jurisdictions are the ones who are making the critical decisions. There are problems in the procurement process, the same kind of problems that we've seen with ventilators and with masks in the COVID realm affect the election realm as well. We need to change our law and regulations. And the partisanship that is, omnipresent in the United States, where there's extensive polarization between the parties on things like vote by mail, at least at the national level, it does not help. And finally, there's incredible unpredictability. We don't know what the status of the virus is going to be in the months leading up to the election. Next slide. And I'll just go quickly just to show the way that Americans have voted, how that's been changing. As you can see, we've been slowly but surely moving toward non-election day precinct voting so that people are voting early or they're voting by mail. Next slide. But that is geographically varied, so that the West Coast has been moving toward all vote by mail. We in California will be mailing out to every voter a ballot. That's true for Oregon, Washington, Utah, Colorado as well. And most recently, Nevada and New Jersey have joined the all vote by mail ranks where they will receive vote by mail. But most, you can see from the gray states here, which are the states that are really the battleground states, most of those states have no excuse absentee voting. And that's really, despite all the controversy from President Trump's Twitter feed about vote by mail, he has said that the way that Florida does it is the right way, which is absentee voting. And that's really in the critical states for this election, that's the kind of voting that's going to happen. Next slide. As you can see though, and I know this is hard to read, but I pointed out the battleground states. You'll see that some states have large sort of histories of voting by mail. So if you look at Arizona in 2018, 79% of their voters voted by mail, but go to the bottom right arrow where North Carolina, it's only 3% who voted by mail. And so the transition is going to be particularly pronounced for certain areas. And so there are voters, in places like North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Georgia that do not have a long sort of history and familiarity with vote by mail. Next slide. And go to the end of this slide too. So what are the challenges with vote by mail? There's obviously what President Trump has been touting, which is the fraud and perception of fraud. The perception is greater than the reality here, right? We don't have an extensive history of vote by mail fraud, but now we see very polarized partisan perceptions of fraud when it comes to mail, and that in and of itself is a problem. But when thinking about mail, and especially those of you who are journalists who are writing about it, it's important to think about there are lots of problems, and there are problems that particularly affect communities of color in particular localities. So as we move to absentee voting, not the all vote by mail, but the ones where you have to apply for a ballot and then get access. Historically, that has been a whiter, more educated, older population that has successfully voted by absentee vote. That is not going to be the case this time in most states. We are seeing a greater racial diversity in absentee balloting because Democrats are now moving more into the absentee balloting realm and Republicans moving away from it. But different types of voters have different levels of distrust of the mail. Historically, African-American voters were much more likely to vote in person, whether it's early or on election day, so they could see the ballot go into the ballot box. Obviously, there are voters with disabilities, people who want to register to vote on the day of the election, who are going to be voting in polling places. And so while we focus so much on mail in this election, we really need to shore up our polling places. I'll just say one thing, and this has to do with the fact that election day polling places are a fail-safe, and that is that you really, one thing that we are seeing, which is very disturbing in the primary elections, particularly among communities of color, is that their votes are less likely to be counted because of either lateness or because of errors in the mail balloting process. If you see on the picture I have in the upper right here of a mail ballot, you notice you have to sign a ballot in order for it to count. And what we're seeing is that there are a lot of people who are not signing that ballot, and that leads to challenges, that leads to problems, and that we should expect a lot of that going forward. We need poll workers, we need safe polling places. You'll notice, one thing that's been happening with the safe polling places, LeBron James and a whole group of sports figures are now pushing the use of sporting arenas. Dodger Stadium in Los Angeles is going to be used as a polling place. The Atlanta Hawks Stadium in Atlanta is going to be used because you need very large facilities in order to ensure social distance. Next slide. So what is to be done with the polling places? We need a massive education and outreach program so that people understand that voting is going to be different this time. There are going to be lots of polling places that are moved, lots of new ways that people are going to be voting. There are going to be people who can vote from their car. You can see an example of that in the picture here. There are going to be, like I said, arena voting. There's going to be different types of voting where you take a number in order to vote because like we do in restaurants, right? But it requires an all hands on deck approach from corporations. Obviously, the Postal Service has been in the crosshairs in the last week. And so we need to shore up the Postal Service to make sure that that can be done in a reliable way. Like I said, it's going to be an incredible challenge in this election season. But if we show the national commitment and we also give the resources to the local officials that they need, I think we'll be able to pull it off. I think we're trying to direct people to vote in person if they can, not only because of the stresses with the Postal Service, but also because we want to make sure that we have results as soon as possible. And so one of the chief barriers to setting up these polling places is that we do not have the same people who have historically voted, who have administered election day polling places. They're not available this year because they tend to be old. And older people are less likely to want to volunteer as poll workers. And so we need a massive outreach campaign. For those of you who are interested, you can go to powerthepolls.org. I'll put that in the chat, powerthepolls.org. And that's a national outreach effort to get people to volunteer as poll workers. And it looks like if you pay poll workers around $300 for a day's worth of work, and it's a grueling day, sometimes 15 hours of work, but $300 seems to get enough poll workers. And so we really need to give them hazard pay and to make sure that they're able to serve. If you're new to voting, or if you're a voter who hasn't voted by mail before, you might be surprised to learn that you actually have to sign your ballot on the outside, right? Because you think your ballot's anonymous. Why should I be able to sign it? So a lot of those voters who are less likely to have voted by mail are either leaving it blank, right, or their signature doesn't match the signature that's on file with the Department of Motor Vehicles. And this is if you had to point to an area where you're going to see the most lawsuits, if there is a close election, this is the area where there's going to be a lot of challenged ballots, because this is the way that we protect against fraud with mail ballots, is the signatures. And I could get into it, but there's a complicated process. If your ballot is challenged because of a lack of signature or a mismatched signature, the jurisdiction generally looks to you, reaches out and says, can you come in? Can you prove that this was you? And we could have tens of thousands of people in that situation. But that's the area where we do see the reason it happens. I think it disproportionately affects Latinos and African Americans is that historically the absentee ballot population was much whiter. And so you're seeing a lot of movement of new voters into the mail process. So anybody who votes by mail for the first time is often going to be a little more likely to make errors. And so as we see this diversification of the absentee ballot pool, we're seeing more errors among those communities. The limited English proficiency question before applies with respect to Latino voters as well, which is that you really do need some language assistance sometimes in particular areas where mail balloting might not be familiar. But I'm also really worried about getting enough Spanish language assistance in the polling place and making sure that those communities have enough poll workers in polling places, right? I mean, you're going to see a loss of close to 25% at least of our polling places in the United States this year. I mean, it's going to be a massive shift. A lot of that is because, places like California are moving all vote by mail, but a lot of it is because places don't have poll workers, they don't have suitable facilities. And so I'm concerned that communities of color, including Latino communities, are going to be caught in the crossfire. It is possible we will know the winner on election night. It's possible that it will be a blowout and that there will be no, doubt. But right now, I think we have to assume that that's unlikely, and that you will have tens of millions of ballots that will not have been counted on election night. If those are ballots in the battleground states, then at least for president, we may not know the victor on election night. And so we need to be patient, and patience is in short supply these days. But we need to make sure that the proper verification and counting of these ballots happens before we announce a victor.
We are in Virginia, and Virginia several years ago was one of those states where sections of Virginia was under the pre-clearance. So we do two things with elections. We work to make sure underrepresented voters, that's voters of color, are going to be able to cast their ballot. And we also build election technology. Next slide. Now, in the United States, there are 245 million age-eligible voters. Of those 245 million age-eligible voters, 48 million of those voters are either on the inactive list or they have already been unregistered. I sometimes refer to those as deactivated voters and deregistered because at one point they were on the active voter list and they did have the ability to cast a regular ballot. Of those 48 million inactive and unregistered voters, 16.6 million are community of color voters. And that's what we're looking at going into the 2020 election. Next slide. Now, we refer to a number of states as voter suppression states, and that is because their rules for voting, their rules for removing people from the rolls are not at all progressive. For instance, in the great state of Texas, you will be unregistered for not renewing your voter registration. You can be unregistered for that, and you need to renew your voter registration every 2 years. In most southern and many western states, they call it maintaining the voter rolls. If you have not voted in whatever number of federal elections that state specifies, you will then be moved to the inactive list. You will normally have one more election. If you do not vote in that election, you will then be moved to unregistered status. Most of these states have strict photo ID requirements. Most of them have no same-day registration. North Carolina is an exception because it offers same-day registration and voting during the early voting period. Most of these states also have no automatic registration. And we understand in a number of these states, there could be real old-fashioned voter intimidation at the polls. Next slide. Skip this one. Next slide. Now, we're going to take a look at some of the states where we work. In North Carolina, there are roughly 6.3 million active voters. And I've broken these out in numbers by the large racial categories where we know where they are. I've omitted other and I've omitted unknown. So these are voters where we do know their race. So North Carolina, by the numbers, is roughly 28% community of color, and 1.3 million of her voters have been deregistered, meaning if they held an election tomorrow, 1.3 million voters would not be able to vote. Now, be aware, states just passed, or we just went by the deadline for states to finalize their file maintenance and do their final voter purges. We will not see those updated numbers probably for another 3 weeks. North Carolina did have roughly 594,000 voters sitting on the inactive voter list. Generally, those voters end up on the unregistered list and the inactive number zeroes out. Next slide. Alabama, much smaller state, roughly 32% of Alabama's voters have been deregistered. Next slide. Texas. Texas now, 13 million voters. Um, I love this number at the bottom. Texas is 34% community of color. We are anticipating by 2024, the next presidential election, Texas will be almost 37% community of color as those young Hispanic voters reach voting age. Currently, well, this now was earlier this year. This was the number we were working to lower. 5.1 million Texans were deregistered. That's 38% of our population had been removed from the voter rolls. And Texas makes no bones about, if you do not vote consistently after 2 federal elections, we will begin the process of removing you from the voter rolls. Next slide. Arizona, same idea, significantly smaller than Texas, barely 20% community of color. And again, 1.1 million voters have been deregistered. What we love about the state of Arizona is Arizona has something called the permanent early voting list, and 40% of Arizona voters are on that list. That means every time an election comes up and they are eligible to vote in that election, they automatically get a ballot mailed to them. Next slide. Mississippi, what an incredible state. A very, very small state. So because there's only 2.3 million voters, you do definitely notice that 561,000 of those voters have been deregistered. Next slide. And the great state of Georgia. Now, Georgia, so far, I was able to see the numbers. Georgia has now moved 800,000 voters to unregistered, and there is another 1.4 million voters that have been dropped from the voter rolls. So Georgia is a little over 2 million voters in Georgia who were able to vote will not be able to vote in the 2020 election unless they become aware they are no longer registered to vote and re-register. Next slide. One of the things that we're proposing, and it's always interesting when other people talk about it, is building a national vote force of younger poll workers. I know at 66, where I vote, I'm one of the kids. So this is definitely something that is overdue. So many states are moving to very, very complicated digital voting equipment. And let's face it, our young people, 18 to 40, this is their generation's equipment. This is their comfort level. And it is a very, very good idea to engage them to be active in election infrastructure. People believe when they register to vote that they are registered forever. People do not register to vote with the understanding that if you don't vote in X number of elections, you're going to be removed from the rolls. Nowhere when you register to vote does it say that. So in my mind, this is a really severe bait and switch. You signed up to vote, and what do you mean I can't vote because I didn't? Well, where was that in the rules? So that is very definitely a problem. And one of the things that happens is states say, oh, we sent our voters a postcard. You sent them a postcard that was very confusing. People get it, they look at it, That's my name, that's my address from the Board of Elections. Okay, yeah, everything looks great. They know where I am. It looks like I'm registered. They missed the fine print that says if you don't send this back, you're going to get deregistered. That ought to be in big red letters across the front of the postcard. We are about to remove you from the voter rolls. What? Communities must be contacted and invited to come out and vote. And one of the things we do is we follow the deregistration list. So as voters are deregistered, we know a lot of times phone numbers aren't good. So we get very old fashioned. We send postcards and we let voters know, check your registration. In 49 states, you can check your voter registration status online. Many of our immigrant voters, they are, of course, new to American voting rules. People who've lived in America all their lives, they don't really know a lot of the American voting rules either, because since we lost Section 4, which many of the states that were under pre-clearance are no longer under pre-clearance. States have been free to make up any rule that they want to target certain groups to limit their vote.
Folks on the call, a lot of times, especially with the comment that was just made, people make the false equivalency between the immigrant vote and the Latino vote. In fact, most Latinos are not immigrants, and most Latino voters are not naturalized citizens. One way to think about the immigrant vote is to look at the share of registered voters who are foreign born. And if you look at it that way, Asian Americans are 28% nationally, 38% in California, roughly, proportional to the Latino population. You also have a significant proportion of white naturalized citizens who are eligible to vote nationally and in California, and significant Black populations if you look nationally as well. So this is something that's critical, I think, for journalists to appreciate. Next slide. Right now, this is preliminary data from a survey that's in the field right now. It'll be released in September. And this is data that's been collected through August 16th of Asian Americans. And what we find is that Asian Americans heavily favor Biden over Trump, but you still have 16% that are undecided. So they're still relatively persuadable compared to the general US population. Next slide. And yet at the same time, party contact has not been forthcoming. So 56% say that they have not been contacted by Democrats, 59% say they have not been contacted by Republicans. Our latest blog post on API data has these numbers and some explanation. Next slide. All right, so that's on the API data side. So to say a little bit about work that we've done in California with California Common Cause in terms of focus groups with low propensity voters and the vote by mail system that is going to be spread throughout California. Next slide. So in terms of the overview, what we tried to do is to assess the needs for low propensity voters in November, probe awareness about voting options and voting mode preferences, exploring messages that motivate and inform these groups, and to deliver recommendations to community organizations as well as election officials. Next slide. So we worked with a lot of community partners in doing this work. Their assistance was invaluable in terms of identifying focus group partners, as well as running some of the focus groups where we didn't have language capacity. Next slide. We also had the involvement of county registrars. Again, that was super helpful because our recommendations inform not only the outreach work by community organizations, but also the materials that are going to be sent out by county registrars as well as the Secretary of State. This has been supported by the Haas Junior Fund. Next slide. Let's just skip this slide in the interest of time. And this slide as well. So key impressions and lessons. One, trusted messengers and their information sources vary according to the group. There is an elevated preference for vote by mail or drop off because of COVID-19. There's concerns about mail-in ballot, the kind of link to track it and whether the vote will be counted. There's concerns about drop-off boxes in terms of where they are and their availability. It's important to explain verification and tracking services, and that helps alleviate some of the vote by mail concerns. And then there's some broader recommendations as well. And community expertise was so critical. Often we think that, of course, we go far when we look to professors as experts, but there's a ton of community expertise, and it was great to have that engagement. Next slide. In terms of who the trusted messengers are, community anchor organizations, official election sources, including online and deadlines for rules, family and friends among those who use word of mouth, traditional media and ethnic media, including radio, television, and print, as well as social media, especially that there's mountains of research in political science that says that mobilization makes a difference. That is actually one of the challenging things in the age of COVID, is that what the research has shown is that door-to-door and face-to-face outreach tends to be the most effective, followed by individual phone calls, and then followed by mailers, and then followed by robocalls. Those tend to be the least effective. So what will be important is to have multiple touch points. And sadly, what we're seeing is actually very few touch points. Part of it is for Asian Americans, they're less likely to live in battleground states. So they're less likely to be reached out to. But let's remember that, there are important congressional elections. There are a bunch of congressional elections where districts flipped in 2018 that have significant API populations. And so we really should be seeing more outreach than we've seen so far. I think it's, when you approach the issue of fraud, I think we need to be careful here, because at least from prior evidence, the risk of voter disenfranchisement has been much larger and well documented than any risk of fraud that has been minuscule and not well established. So the reason why I say that is we actually could get into a situation where misperception about fraud might actually reduce turnout, and we absolutely do not want that to happen. We can always run audits based on if mail ballots were sent, in terms of whether they reached their destination and whether they got held up. But we absolutely do not want people holding back from participating in vote by mail because of any concerns about fraud. As far as I understand it, especially with the U.S. Postal Service, there's a lot of congressional inquiries right now to ensure that those pieces get to their destinations on time and that they are not bottlenecked up in some distribution center somewhere. But that is something that is ultimately traceable. If people refrain from voting by mail because of concerns over fraud, that I would argue is the most damage that could be done in terms of ensuring as much turnout as possible among our populations.
While I am excited to see the Asian American electorate so energized, I am mindful that our communities have yet to maximize our political power. And there are still some challenges facing Asian American voters in this upcoming election. And I'm going to take a few moments to address these challenges and how we can help ensure that they are able to effectively exercise their right to vote. But even as we continue to see an increase in voter engagement by Asian Americans, each election shows a consistent 15 to 20% gap between Asian American voter participation and that of non-Latino whites. For example, the last two presidential elections saw eligible Asian Americans registering and voting at about 17% less than non-Latino whites. Interesting to note, however, that once Asian Americans are registered, the turnout rate of those registered achieve at least parity, or in some cases are actually higher for Asian Americans. For the last two presidential elections, the difference between Asian American voters voting and non-Latino whites was 1% less for 2016 and 3% less for 2012. So this is one of the reasons it's so important to engage Asian American voters, and Karthik's data helps inform us on how best to do so. Of course, another way to help Asian Americans maximize their voting power is to address one of the major barriers to the ballot box, which was raised a little bit earlier in this discussion, the language barrier. About 3 in 4 Asian Americans speak a language other than English at home. And about a third of Asian Americans are limited English proficient and face some difficulties communicating in English. So this language barrier impedes access to the ballot for a number of reasons. First, voting materials are too complex. An analysis of voting materials from all 50 states revealed that they are consistently written at high school or college level and use complex English, such as containing longer sentences or complicated vocabulary and grammar. Voting materials can often be difficult for fluent English speakers, much less for those for whom English is a second language. Second, the voting process is complicated, as we have heard today, especially for limited English proficient voters who come from countries with much different democratic systems, who need to navigate the daunting, complex election process in America. Asian American voters with language assistance needs are also often denied needed assistance at the polls. Asian American voters have also experienced discrimination through hostile and unwelcoming environments, as well as the blatant denial of their right to vote. So it is important that Asian American voters are aware of the rights they have to language assistance when voting. The Voting Rights Act protects voters against discrimination due to their membership in a language minority group. That is, Asian American voters cannot be discriminated against for having an accent or having some difficulties with English when voting. Furthermore, Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act that Professor Persley had referenced earlier requires certain jurisdictions who have met a specific threshold to provide language assistance in the covered language throughout the election process through translated written materials, multilingual poll workers at polling places, and the publication of such assistance to the covered community. Currently, there are Asian languages covered in 27 political subdivisions in 12 states. Chinese has the most coverage, with Vietnamese, Filipinos, Koreans, Asian Indians, Cambodians, and Bangladeshi following in descending order. For limited English proficient voters who live outside of Section 203 covered jurisdictions, Section 208 of the Voting Rights Act provides them the right to have someone of their choice assist them in the voting process, so long as the person assisting them is not one's employer or union representative. This means Asian American voters who need language assistance can bring someone with them to the polls to assist them, such as a friend or relative. Of course, the upcoming election has been thrown into chaos for many reasons, has been well described so far. As we all work to address the public health and safety needs with respect to the 2020 elections in, the coronavirus pandemic context, there are specific ways to help ensure limited English proficient voters can access the language assistance they need. As we've discussed, we know that the no excuse absentee voting or vote by mail has increased in the COVID-19 context as a critical way to allow people to vote while maintaining safety. And vote by mail has been an important option for limited English proficient voters, where they have the ability to vote from the comfort of their own home, taking all the time they need to vote comfortably, and being able to get language assistance from their friends and relatives without having to coordinate schedules to go to the polls together. Expanding this opportunity makes sense as a general matter, but even more so during this pandemic. And of course, covered jurisdictions must adhere and comply with Section 203 when implementing their vote by mail system. At the same time, as was highlighted by the previous discussion, vote by mail may not work for all limited English proficient voters. And as Professor Persley noted, it is critical to ensure that there are safe in-person options as well. For limited English proficient voters, it allows them the opportunity to receive in-person language assistance in covered jurisdictions at the polls, where a trained bilingual poll worker can assist them. Another issue is the potential increase in voter challenges and voter intimidation against Asian Americans, as an extension of the COVID-19 related anti-Asian sentiments and violence that we have seen to date. These types of voter challenges and voter intimidation have been utilized in the past against Asian Americans, based primarily on the harmful stereotype of Asian Americans being the quote-unquote perpetual foreigner and thus assumed to be a non-citizen. So I know this is a lot of information that I've thrown at you. For a first-time Asian American voter for whom English is a second language, this much information could quickly become overwhelming to the point of inertia. This is why Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, has developed in-language translated materials to explain these rights and explain how Asian American voters can exercise their right to vote. This information is available on our website at www.advancingjustice-aajc.org. Additionally, in partnership with API and Vote, we run an Asian language election protection hotline and have done so since 2012. The hotline, 888-API-VOTE or 888-274-8683, provides assistance to voters in English and 8 Asian languages: Cantonese, Mandarin, Korean, Vietnamese, Tagalog, Hindi, Urdu, and Bengali, and is available year-round to answer questions and assist with problems. We are happy to help people figure out whether they are registered, how they can register, where their polling place is located, and other common questions. We can also assist if voters encounter problems at the polls, whether from a hostile poll worker to long lines and missing translated ballots. There are no questions too big or too small, so we encourage everyone who has a question about how to vote to call us at 888-API-VOTE. Together, we can make sure to maximize our political power. Thank you.